What if the poorest man in town was actually guarding a secret worth more than every ranch, bank and gold mine in the entire West? And what if the woman who married him was the only person he trusted enough to reveal it to? In the winter of 1883, Eleanor Hart walked into a tiny frontier church, wearing the simplest dress she owned, and married Silas Boone, the man everyone in Black Hollow called a worthless mountain beggar. The townspeople laughed. Some even felt sorry for her. They believed she had thrown away her future. But 3 nights later, Silas opened a hidden door beneath his cabin floor, and showed Eleanor a map leading to a kingdom that had supposedly disappeared from the earth more than 100 years earlier. And before sunrise, someone tried to kill them to keep that kingdom hidden forever. If you love emotional frontier mysteries with shocking twists, like this video and subscribe to Meaningful Impact 2.1, because this story is only beginning. Eleanor had never imagined marrying a poor mountain man. At 28, she had spent years dreaming of a quiet home after losing her father and their family farm to debt. Then Jeremiah Crow, the richest rancher in Black Hollow, offered her everything she thought she needed: a large house, servants, horses, and a life without hunger. But Eleanor had seen the cruelty behind Jeremiah's wealth. He treated poor workers like they were invisible and believed every piece of land had a price. So when he proposed, Eleanor refused. The whole town thought she was foolish. Then Silas Boone appeared at her door. Silas owned almost nothing. His coat was patched, his boots were worn, and his small cabin stood so far beyond town that most people rarely saw him. Yet Eleanor had noticed something strange about him. Whenever a widow needed firewood, Silas left a pile outside her door. Whenever a child was hungry, somehow food appeared. He never asked for payment. One freezing evening, Eleanor watched Silas give his last loaf of bread to a starving boy. When she asked what he would eat, he simply smiled and said, "Tomorrow will take care of tomorrow." That answer stayed in her heart. A week later, Silas asked Eleanor to marry him. He warned her honestly that he had no wealth to offer. "I can't promise you a mansion," he said. "I can't promise you an easy life, but I can promise that I will never lie to you." Eleanor looked into his tired eyes and realized something the town had failed to see. Silas might have been poor in money, but he was rich in character. She accepted. Their wedding lasted less than 20 minutes. No flowers, no celebration, no expensive feast. Just a handful of people inside a small wooden church, while snow fell outside. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Jeremiah Crow walked out without congratulating them. That night, Eleanor followed Silas into his cabin. She expected poverty, but instead she found something far stranger. The walls were covered with old symbols, strange mountain drawings, and faded sketches of a magnificent city surrounded by clouds. In the center of one drawing stood a stone tower with a symbol identical to the silver compass Silas kept around his neck. Eleanor stared at him. "What is this?" Silas locked the door. Then he said, "The reason I needed you to marry me." Eleanor stepped backward. Silas quickly explained that he hadn't married her for money or protection. His grandfather had spent decades searching for a hidden valley high in the mountains. According to family records, an isolated kingdom had once existed there. Its people had vanished from every known map after outsiders attempted to take their land. Silas's grandfather discovered the entrance but disappeared before he could return. Silas had spent 3 years following his grandfather's clues. Then he showed Eleanor something that made her breath catch. It was an old photograph. In it stood Silas's grandfather beside a group of people, dressed in unfamiliar clothing. Behind them was the same impossible city Eleanor had seen in the drawings. "But why me?" she whispered. Silas looked at her. "Because my grandfather left one final instruction. He said the door would never open for a man traveling alone." Before Eleanor could ask what that meant, 3 loud knocks struck the cabin door. Silas immediately extinguished the lantern. Another knock, then a man's voice came through the darkness. "Boone, we know what you're hiding." Eleanor recognized the voice. Jeremiah Crow. Silas grabbed his rifle, but he didn't fire. Instead he pulled Eleanor toward the fireplace and moved a heavy iron stove aside. Beneath it was a hidden wooden trapdoor. "Get down," he whispered. They entered a narrow underground passage just as the cabin door crashed open. Jeremiah and his men searched the room. One man shouted, "They're gone." Jeremiah stared at the floor, then he smiled. "Good. Let them lead us to the kingdom." Far beneath the cabin, Eleanor looked at Silas in disbelief. "You knew he would follow us." Silas shook his head. "No, but now we have a bigger problem." He pointed toward the tunnel ahead. the silver compass in his hand had begun glowing faintly, and from somewhere deep inside the mountain came the sound of a bell, one slow ring, then another. Silas whispered, "Someone is still living there." The tunnel suddenly trembled. Behind them, Jeremiah's men were getting closer. Ahead waited a forgotten kingdom. And between the two was a secret that Silas had never told Eleanor. He had been there before. Eleanor could hardly breathe after hearing Silas's confession. "You've been there?" Silas nodded as they hurried through the underground passage. "Once, 3 years ago, I reached the outer gate, but I was turned away." He stopped for a moment and looked at her. "The people inside told me I could return only when I understood why my grandfather had failed." Eleanor asked what that meant, but Silas didn't answer. They continued through the darkness, until the tunnel opened onto a narrow stone ledge. Then Eleanor stepped forward and froze. Below them stretched a valley hidden above the clouds. Green forests covered the mountainsides, despite the winter surrounding them. Silver waterfalls dropped from cliffs into blue pools, ancient stone bridges connected enormous towers, and hundreds of warm lights glowed inside the distant settlement. It wasn't a ruined kingdom, it was alive. Eleanor whispered, "How could nobody know this exists?" Silas answered, "Because everyone who discovered it wanted to own it." They followed the stone path toward the city. But before they reached the gates, a group of armed guards surrounded them. Their leader was an elderly woman with silver hair and a long dark cloak. She looked at Silas, then at Eleanor, then at the silver compass. Her expression changed completely. "After all these years," she whispered, "the Boone family finally returned." Silas lowered his head. The woman told them the truth. The hidden kingdom had survived, because its people had protected the valley from outsiders for generations. The legendary treasure wasn't gold. The valley contained rare healing springs, fertile land, ancient knowledge, and something even more valuable, a massive library containing records of settlements and families lost during the expansion of the American frontier. But there was one final secret: Silas's grandfather had not disappeared. He had stayed. He had become one of the kingdom's protectors. Eleanor stared at Silas. "You knew?" Silas shook his head. "No, I thought he died." The elderly woman reached into her cloak and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was an old letter. Silas opened it with trembling hands. The letter was from his grandfather. It explained why he had never returned to the outside world. Years earlier, Jeremiah Crow's father had discovered the kingdom and tried to force its people to reveal their land. Silas's grandfather helped them escape and promised to protect the location forever. But before he died, he left one final warning. The kingdom will be safe only when the next Boone chooses trust over greed. Silas slowly looked at Eleanor. Then the sound of gunfire shattered the valley. Jeremiah Crow had arrived. He and his men had followed the tunnel and reached the kingdom. Jeremiah stepped forward, laughing. "So this is what your family has been hiding." He demanded the land deeds and claimed that because the kingdom contained valuable resources, he had the right to control it. The elders refused. Jeremiah raised his weapon. Silas stepped in front of Eleanor. But Eleanor suddenly noticed something on the stone floor, the ancient symbol, the same symbol from the compass. She remembered Silas's words about his grandfather. The door would never open for a man traveling alone. Suddenly she understood. The kingdom wasn't looking for a man, it was looking for two people who trusted each other completely. Eleanor took Silas's hand and placed it against the ancient symbol. The ground began to shake. A hidden section of the mountain opened behind the throne. Inside was not gold, it was a vast underground chamber filled with books, maps, documents and sealed wooden chests. Jeremiah stared in disbelief. Silas's grandfather had left evidence proving that hundreds of acres of land around Black Hollow had originally belonged to families who had been cheated and forced away by powerful landowners. Jeremiah's own family name appeared repeatedly in the records. The secret kingdom wasn't merely a hidden refuge, it held the evidence that could expose the greatest land fraud in the region. Jeremiah panicked. "Destroy it!" His men rushed toward the chamber, but the mountain suddenly shook violently. A crack opened across the stone floor. Jeremiah lost his balance and dropped his weapon. Silas grabbed him before he fell. For a moment, Eleanor expected Silas to let him go. Instead, Silas pulled him to safety. Jeremiah stared at him in disbelief. "Why would you save me?" Silas answered quietly. "Because my grandfather taught me that protecting the innocent doesn't mean becoming cruel to the guilty." Jeremiah lowered his head. For the first time, he had nothing to say. Weeks later, the evidence from the hidden library was carefully taken to the proper authorities. Jeremiah's land claims were challenged, and many families finally recovered what had been stolen from them. But the location of the secret kingdom was never revealed. Eleanor and Silas returned to their little cabin in the mountains. It was still small, their clothes were still simple. They still had little money, yet Eleanor no longer saw the cabin as a symbol of poverty. It was home. One evening, as snow fell quietly outside, Eleanor asked Silas whether he regretted bringing her into his dangerous secret. Silas smiled. "No, because I spent my whole life searching for a kingdom." He looked at her, "And I didn't realize I had already found something more valuable." Eleanor smiled. Outside, the mountains disappeared beneath a blanket of snow. High above them, hidden beyond the clouds, the ancient kingdom remained untouched. And whenever the silver compass pointed toward those mountains, Eleanor remembered the lesson that had changed her life forever. The richest person isn't always the one with the most money. Sometimes, the richest person is the one who has something priceless to protect. And someone courageous enough to stand beside them. The town that once laughed at Eleanor for marrying the poorest mountain man eventually stopped laughing because they finally understood something Eleanor had discovered on the very first night. Silas Boone had never been poor. He had simply been protecting a treasure the world wasn't ready to understand. If this story touched your heart, like this video and subscribe to Meaningful Impact 2.1 for more powerful frontier stories filled with mystery, courage, sacrifice, and unforgettable twists. And remember, sometimes the greatest treasure isn't waiting beneath the ground, sometimes it's waiting above the clouds.